Morning, everybody. How you guys doing?
Good.
So what we're going to take a look at today is working with gradients and blends. This is kind of a fun way of working. It's something that we haven't really played around with a whole ton. It's also gotten a lot easier to use with newer versions of Illustrator. So we're going to take a look at that today. There's two start files for today. So if you guys jump into Blackboard and take a look at the lesson 11, inside the start folder, there is a couple things for you guys. And let me share my screen with you guys instead of just this. So inside there's lesson 11 start files. There's a video of the demo from last semester. I'll be posting up the new one once we're wrapped up today. There's a couple quick things as far as working with the gradient tool, freeform gradients, and then creating patterns, a couple different just short things for you there. But everything you'll need is inside of there. And then everything that we're gonna be working on today, I have up and ready to go for us. So this is what your start file looks like. So again, what we're gonna take a look at is the idea of working with these gradients. They're really, really easy to work with. It used to be in older versions of Illustrator, it was a little bit slower of a process, and you could really only do one of two things. You could either make things go like in a straight line or with like a circle. They've changed it a lot. They've also made it so that you can apply gradients to strokes, and then you can change the angles. There's a ton of different things you can do with them now. So it's kind of a fun way of working. So we'll be playing around with that today. So first thing I want to take a look at is, before we actually jump into the file, I want to look at two things actually. I want to first look at my layers panel. I want to see how this file is built. You guys are probably going to notice that as you're working, there's a bunch of different stuff. When we're done, we're going to turn on, there's like this extras layer, some extra pieces that were built, these blends, there's this type layer. So there's some extra pieces that we're going to put in there. Nothing too major, but I just want to make sure that we're aware. And as we're working, we're going to be working on a couple different layers. We got this background, we got this plant. So as we kind of click on different pieces, we'll be able to select those different areas. So that was the first thing I want to take a look at. Second thing is this gradient box itself. So if you take a look under Window and pull up in this gradient panel, go to Window and go to Gradient. It also looks like this. It kind of shows you a gradient. Now again, the idea with a gradient is that it's essentially fading one color into another. Now again, like early versions of Illustrator, you can only fade one color into another. Now you can apply multiple colors within a gradient. So there's a lot of different ways you can use these things. And if you take a look inside the panel here, you'll see that there's different types. There's these linear gradients where it's just kind of like a straight line. It shows us a little preview here. There's these radial gradients where it's a circular gradient, starts from the inside and kind of blends out in a circle in all directions. And then there's this freeform gradient. Depending on your machine, when you first click on the freeform gradient, it has to load, so it may take a second or two. It's not like your machine's just locked up or anything. It's just that the freeform gradient kind of requires a little bit more processing power. So when you first click on that, if it seems like everything becomes unresponsive, just give it a second, it'll catch back up. So what we're going to start with first is we're going to start with just this linear gradients. We're going to take a look at how we can apply this and what we can do with it. Now, what I want to do with a linear gradient before I get too far with anything is I need to basically apply this just like I'd apply color to anything else. So in order to apply it, you need to have an object selected. So we're going to click on these like little tentacle things at the bottom here. And right now it's just a solid color. So what I want to do to apply my gradient is, there's a couple different ways. When I have this up, there's actually some pre-saved, and you can pre-save gradients in here. So you can pull up in a gradient that way. You could also apply it on the bottom of your toolbar here. That's like a quick way of applying a gradient to something. And it always defaults to this black and white, but we're not stuck with that. Once we have the gradient set, that's what this bar is going to do. So here we can control where the gradient color sets. And then we've got this midpoint selector, so we can kind of control how it breaks. And if we want to change the colors, we're just double clicking on this little gradient slider, and it drops down our swatches. We could also do a color selector, we could do a color picker, and if we wanted to change the color mode too, so say I wanted to change this into RGB, and actually I'll go CMYK because that's what the document's built at. I can tell because it says right here. I could also grab a color out of that. So there's a bunch of different ways to select it. I'm just going to grab out of swatches. They have some stuff that's pre-built in there for me. So I'm going to grab kind of like this pinkish shade. It almost like matches the background a little bit. And then for my start of my gradients, I'm going to go, I'm going to double click this one. I'm going to set it to black. And I think that kind of looks okay, but what I want to actually do is I want to change the direction that this gradient kind of breaks from. So there's a couple ways you could do this. You can use this to set the angle of your gradient. So say I wanted to flip it to 180 degrees, or I wanted to flip it to 90 degrees. I can control it that way, but I also have over on my toolbar this gradient tool. So if I press on this, it actually shows me how this is set. Now, I can use this, or I can click and drag, and I can control the gradient in any direction I want. So the nice part about this is it gives you a lot more nuance with it. It kind of gives you a little bit more direction, a little bit more angle. You can kind of control that break. And then if I need to adjust it up or down, I can kind of control these different points. I can also control this slider. So instead of having to kind of guess where things are based on how the art is built, I can use this to really fine tune that gradient and where that midpoint break is, just like that. Now, whenever I'm done working with a gradient, all I need to do is click away to deselect it. And the other thing to keep in mind is we can actually save gradients as swatches. So if I click on this, I can click and I can drag this down. It's now saved this as a swatch. So this is actually a reusable gradient. So I can apply that to a different piece, which I actually want to do right down here to this thing. So now we've seen applying a gradient onto a solid object as a fill. So let's take a look at applying it as a stroke. So now if you take a look, when we have this object selected here, we're seeing that there's a stroke of gold and a fill of none. So I'm going to click on the stroke area so that I can select that stroke option. And then I'm going to click on that gradient that I just saved. And now what it does is it looks like it's just applying it from left to right across it. Let's jump back into our gradient panel. When you have a stroke selected, notice that a whole new set of features pops open in here. So now we can see there's different ways of doing it. We can apply it within the stroke. We can apply it along the stroke. And then we can do it across the stroke. So if you see, now it's kind of evenly going from left to right, or from top to bottom, or just within that stroke. Now, once I have this thing selected, I kind of like how this one looks. I think it gives me kind of a nice effect. But I want to play around with my shading a little bit on this. So now I can adjust this, and notice that it still controls that gradient break. It doesn't adjust the master version. This isn't a global swatch. It's just applying it here. But now it's giving me that effect there. And maybe it's a little too dark, so I can just bump this point back a little bit. And it kind of blends in a little bit here, but that's okay because we're going to change our background anyways. Now, say that I wanted to add in a different color. Maybe I wanted to kind of blend from like this pink to black and then back into pink. If I slide over, I can actually click. And if you notice here how I've got that little plus button that shows up, if I click, that adds in a new gradient point. So now I can grab this. I'm going to go back and maybe I'll select like a slightly different shade. Maybe like a little bit darker. There we go. And then because of the style, and again, I have to have the object selected for this to work. So let me try that again. That purple. And now you're seeing it show up inside of there. It might be a little bit easier if I zoom in a little to kind of see it in a little more detail. And then I can adjust this, bring these all the way up to the edges. I'm going to kind of snug in a little bit to that gray point, that midpoint. Select that one. And now if I click away, I can kind of see the whole thing. Now it's giving me kind of like a nice, almost like 3D style effect. So let me zoom back out. So that's applying that across a stroke. So really it's the same basic process. It's just a matter of selecting the object, then it's applying the styling, whether you're going to do it within, along, or across that stroke. So far so good? That making sense? Anybody got any questions on that? So what I want to do next is I want to apply a color to this background. I want to take this, and instead of having this pink, I want to make this look like it's actually like underwater. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to apply kind of like a blend of like white to kind of like dark blue to black, or maybe even like a lighter blue to darker blue to black, and kind of make it look like the sun's up here and that it's kind of getting darker as it goes along the bottom. So first thing I want to do is I want to select the object. I'm going to select this background. And I want to make sure that I was working on stroke. I want to make sure I'm not applying this just to the stroke. I want to apply this to the fill. Now with fill selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that radial gradient option, and it's just going to give me a default box. Now, first thing, before I get too worried about where the position is or how the overall look of it, what I want to do is I want to start playing around with my colors. I know I want to go dark on the outer edge. On the inner edge, I'm going to go to kind of like a darker blue, and then at that break point, I'm going to go with like a lighter blue. Maybe that one I think will do. Now you can see that like this from a color perspective probably looks like it'll break pretty well in terms of looking like there's like a light source, but it wouldn't make sense that the light would come from that direction. So I'm actually going to grab that gradient tool again. I'm going to click and I'm going to drag down in this direction here. And now you can see it's giving me a really, really big gradient. So if I zoom way out here and I grab that gradient tool again, you can see I've got a couple of options. I can control how kind of strong it is. If I need to skew it in a little bit, maybe I don't want this thing to be, I want this to kind of have like a little bit of a point. I can kind of control the width of that. So again, as I'm clicking, and if I don't like anything, I can always just click and redraw, and then it redefines where those points are and how that circle kind of breaks. So maybe I want to go a little bit wider with it. I think that looks pretty good right there. Let me zoom back into my artboard. And I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's doing what I want it to do. So far so good. That making sense? Anybody got any questions on any of this? And again, feel free to throw them into the chat too if you got a question. Now, we've seen fills, we've seen linear, we've seen radial, we've seen strokes, but what we haven't seen is applying this, instead of doing this one at a time, you can actually apply this to multiple objects. So that's what I want to take a look at next. I want to take a look at applying this across a bunch of different ones. I have some pre-built gradients in here. So if I take a look at my swatches panel, I got this guy right here, this plant one. So let's try and apply this thing. I'm going to grab this and I'm going to hold my shift key and I'm going to select all these like little chunks of plant here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on that plant gradient. Now what it does is it just applies it across all of them, right? But we saw that with this gradient tool, if I click and drag, I can actually apply them all at once. So maybe I want to go lighter to darker that way. And again, where I click and drag from, that's going to control it. So if I want to maybe make it a little bit lighter on the inside and darker on the edge, I can make a smaller one, or I can go at different angles. Maybe make it a little bit more intense so it kind of follows the light source. I could kind of come this way with it. So there's a couple different ways that I can do it. I think I'm just going to do a little something like that. And then when I'm done, I'm just going to click away to deselect. And now it's applying that gradient. And you'll notice it's real subtle. It's lighter on the top, darker towards the bottom. But that's really the idea when you're working with gradients. So I want to try and make them as subtle as possible. So now that we've seen that, speaking of subtlety, let's take a look at adding some transparency to these things. So we got this jellyfish, and we're going to apply some color here, but I want to make it look like there's kind of like a transparent object floating over the top of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this object, and I'm going to jump back into my gradient panel. And I want to apply a gradient to this thing, but I want it to be linear. Now I'm going to change the colors here. I'm going to go from like a light blue to kind of like a dark blue. So grab this one, and for my other angle, I'll grab this darker blue. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my gradient tool, and I'm going to re-drag the gradients. Something like that'll probably work. Now, once I have the gradient selected, notice I have this opacity. So what I can do is I can knock this back. So maybe I'll set this to around 40%, and I have it on this slider. Same thing on this guy. I'm going to grab that point. I'm going to set that to 40% as well. And if it looks like it's maybe not quite light enough, I can kind of reposition it. And that looks like that should be good because this is going to appear over the top of that. And I'm going to arrange it, bring this to the front right away. Now, I can set it over the top and it shows our transparency, but that's not exactly what I'm looking for. What I want to do is I want to take this and I want to apply that third type of gradient. So now we've seen linear and radial. I want to apply that freeform gradient to this thing. I want to apply some actual color to this. So when you apply a freeform gradient, what it does is it basically just gives you little points, and then it lets you determine where you want those points to sit and what color you want them to be, and then it automatically blends them with each other. So I think what I want to do on this is I want to set them to 3 pretty different colors just so we can really see what this is going to look like. So for this top one, I'm going to double click on it. I'm going to go to maybe something brighter. I got this yellow. Let's apply that. The bottom right corner, let's set that to white. In here, I'm going to set this kind of more of like a reddish color, get kind of like this burgundy. I'll throw that in there. And if I want to add one more gradient spot, I can just click, and right in the middle, I'm going to double click this. I'm going to set that to black. Now, if I want to increase the amount, I can click and drag this, and then it's going to kind of bump into all the other colors and blend those all out. So this is like a really good way of applying different shading. You guys are going to see next week, we're going to work with brushes a little bit, and we're actually going to have an assignment where we take a look at doing like a self-portrait. This is a really great way of actually, like if you use real like subtle light colors, of doing skin tones and like getting like a little bit more red on a cheek, or a little bit more lightness in an area or darkness in an area, like if a shadow's cast across like a cheekbone, that type of thing. So you can really do some incredible looking stuff with it. It's really almost photorealistic looking, real simply. So now we've got our freeform gradient. We're going to throw this thing right on top and kind of get that jellyfish look to it. And now we're pretty much doing everything that we want it to do. So now that is it for gradients. It's a pretty straightforward process. Last thing I want to do on this is I just want to, oh, actually, no, there's one more thing I want to do. I want to make one more type of process. I want to do a blend. So if you see how this is set right here, you see how it's kind of like a gradient, but a little bit different. And if you hover over it, it's actually two different vector lines. I'm going to do the same thing here. I got this pink one and this purple one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to blend these two objects together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select them both. And I've got this blending tool. I'm going to click on this. Now what the blend tool is going to do is it's going to take the property of one object and it's going to blend it with another one. So if I click on this one to set as my start point, and I click on this one to set as my secondary point, now if you take a look, it gave me a nice blend. And this isn't just a gradient, because you can see it interacts a little bit differently. From these points here, it gives it a little bit more depth, almost like a three-dimensional quality to it. If you want to change anything that you do on a blend, you can actually select it and double click on the blend tool and notice that there's different options here. So I could do it as smooth color, specified steps, distance. So maybe I wanted to do it steps. So let's see what it looked like if I added like 15 steps. Now you can kind of see it breaking up. Maybe let's do like 5 steps and see what it looks like. You can see if I do these steps, I can actually one starts kind of merging into the other. So it automatically adds in all the pieces in between. I just want smooth color though. That's going to give me what I want. And I'm going to group this as one big finished object. I can slide this into place right over here. And then the last thing I'm going to do is jump back into my layers panel. And I'm going to turn on all those additional layers. And that is what our finished product looks like for this. So when you're done, you can save this as a PDF and send it over. Again, pretty straightforward. You get some really great looking results really quickly with it. All the other pieces on here, you can see they're just basically like simple vector shapes with gradients applied to them. And that's all they were really doing to get this really nice finished look on here. Now, the other thing that's not included on this that I want to take a look at on that start part 2 is a pattern maker. What I want to do is I want to apply a pattern onto the tops and bottoms of this cake piece here. And I've noticed I got this other little artboard here. This is something that you're going to come back to. This is actually going to be an option for your final project, but there's a whole separate pattern maker built into here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this object. If you take a look, you've got all these different menu options up here, right? But if you take a look under object, down here under pattern, you can make a pattern based off a selected object. So when I do make, what it's going to do is it's going to give me a little, okay, it's been added to the swatches panel. Cool. I see it right there. And it's going to give me some options here. So now I can control how I want this thing to look. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So everything that happens inside of here is going to be based off of what I tell it. So do I want it to be a grid? Do I want to brick it? Do I want to column it? So that's going to control how it repeats itself. And then what I can also control is what's inside of it. So say that I was going to copy paste this object and maybe I wanted another one. I can do that. The stacking order is going to make a difference. So if I arrange and I bring it to the front, where it sits on top of everything, and notice anything you add in here will automatically be added into that pattern. So anything that sits inside this box, it'll just repeat based on these rules you set. So once I'm done with this thing, I can go up here and I can hit done. And now the pattern is saved inside my panel here. So now all I need to do is just take it. And what I'm going to do is under window, I'm going to go down to my properties. And here I've got fill, stroke, all that. So what I want to do is I want to actually apply this onto my panel here. So what I'm going to do is redock that. Appearance is in a funky spot. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to apply this thing right on here by coming up, setting it on there, and then that's how you can apply that on. So once you build it, it just becomes, and it acts just like another fill, another object. Make sense? So when you guys are done with these things, you can stop, save them both as PDFs and email them to me. There is no extension project for this week. What I'm going to give you guys for the rest of the week is just time to wrap up your recharge logos and get that all taken care of. Next week, we're going to take a look at working with brushes, and we're going to start in on a self-portrait project. So really, that's going to be it for you guys as far as like this week and then moving forward, what we'll be doing next week. Next week is our last week before spring break. So you'll have the spring break period to work on wrapping up your self-portraits. And then when we get back from spring break, we're going to have one more lesson, and then we're actually going to jump into the final projects. So I'd say like now, if you're missing any work, you're behind any assignments, it's kind of like a good timing going into spring break because it'll give you like an extra week to just get caught up on anything. And remember, if you are missing any assignments, all you need to do, get them wrapped up, send them over to me as PDFs, and you should have no problems with it. So if there are any questions on any of this stuff, I will be hanging out. If you guys just want to work on this and ask questions as you're going, I'll leave my window open. Otherwise, that is what I got for you guys for this week. So have a good one, and I will see you next week.